Okay. The book that I read was Privilege and Creative Destruction, the Charles River Bridge Case, which is about a law case, or a lawsuit, that went to the Supreme Court in Massachusetts during the 1830s. First, a little bit about the author. He's a historian, an author, a law professor. He specializes in legal and political institutions and constitutional history. He's written 6 books, and he's often a commentator on a lot of national programs like NPR, and he's on several television programs, and he's worked as a historical advisor on a few different prominent films. So he's really a history buff, and this book is really set up to be kind of like a history book. It doesn't focus a lot on creative destruction except in the last chapter, which is less than 20 pages long. But if you're familiar with the concept of creative destruction while you're going through it, it's so detailed that it really gives you a good idea of how this community was shaped by creative destruction and when the need for it came in. So it's almost 200 pages long, so it's pretty detailed. So this is just going to hit on some of the main points and sound a little bit like a history lesson. But the book has a lot more to do with creative destruction than it necessarily says. It just okay. A little bit about the case. The Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge. In a broad sense, it was about individual rights versus community welfare. It had to do with the dispute between community needs and previously held property rights, and whether or not property owners deserve compensation if government-sponsored activity impairs an existing property interest. So I'm going to start where the book started because I think it's important to know what set up this whole dispute about bridges. In 1630, the only way to get across this bridge, or across this river that was in the Boston area, was by ferry, and it was set up between Boston and Charlestown, and you guys will see a map on the next slide so you get a better idea of that. But the system was really unreliable, and it had a lot, if the weather was bad, you couldn't take the ferry. It wasn't the greatest mode of transportation. In 1640, they added Cambridge to the system so that people could travel to Harvard. And in 1713, the earliest proposal of a bridge was brought up, which Harvard protested because they liked the money that they were raking in from leasing out their ferries, but that bridge didn't actually get built. It wasn't until 1785 when 2 different groups requested to build toll bridges. The first one was led by John and Andrew Cabot. They were brothers, and they wanted their bridge from Cambridge to Boston, and their plan was to invest their money into the bridge and have it be a toll bridge only until their investment had been repaid. They weren't really in it for the profit. And the other group was led by Thomas Russell, and they wanted the bridge between Charlestown and Boston. And they actually wanted to continue tolling people for traveling on the bridge after their investment had been returned so that they could make something of a profit. And I'm not sure if this was the main reason that their group got chosen, but they said that if the bridge was between Cambridge and Boston instead of Charlestown and Boston, that the north portion of Boston would see a shift in property because everyone would want to be near the bridge, and they thought that that would damage Boston. And I don't know if that was just something that they came up with to get their point across, but they ended up being granted permission to fund the bridge project between Charlestown and Boston. They were privately funding it, but the legislature got to decide a lot about it. They had a large say in the construction of the bridge, and they set the schedule of tolls and how much the toll had to be. And in return, they guaranteed the proprietors 40 years worth of profit from the toll, which was later extended another 30 years, but I'll get into that in a little bit. It opened in 1786, and it was a huge success. The total cost of it at the beginning was estimated at $50,000, which wasn't a problem for them to get to after a couple years. And the only thing that they had to do with that money besides keeping it for themselves was maintaining the bridge, and they had to pay Harvard annually as compensation for the loss of the money that it was making from its ferry system. First problem for them came in 1792 when the Massachusetts legislature approved another bridge that would have been from Boston to Cambridge, and they complained that the new bridge would cut their profit by half and it would hinder their progress toward repaying all their debt. So in exchange, the legislature, that's when they extended the charter from 40 years to 70 years. So they were going to be able to make profit for almost double what they thought they were going to. At that time, their profit was around $20,000 annually, and after the term of their charter was extended, they didn't really complain about any other bridges because they got so much in return. And by 1814, their stocks sold for over 600% higher than the original price, so they were doing really well. The reason for the case is the Warren Bridge. In 1823, a group petitioned to build a toll-free bridge across the river because they thought that with all of the economic growth and the population increase that it was time for a free bridge because so many people were traveling back and forth. A lot of the real estate owners in Charleston supported it because they thought their property values would increase if they had free access to Boston. But obviously the Charles River Bridge owners opposed it because it meant that they would be losing all their money because the bridges were supposed to be pretty close to each other and no one was going to pay to go across their bridge. Owners of property along the river also opposed it because navigating the river near a drawbridge was hard enough already, and so they thought that if there were two of them that were next to each other, it would make it really difficult, and they thought that that would actually decrease their property. And Harvard was still receiving an annual payment from the Charles River Bridge people, so they opposed it as well. In 1824, the bill went into legislature, and the Warren Bridge people said that there was a public need for a new bridge, but that didn't really go any farther. And in 3 years after that, it was approved. But within the same month, the governor of Massachusetts vetoed it because he said that he could understand why there might be a need for a toll-free bridge, but he thought that compensation was necessary because he knew that they would be completely destroying the Charles River Bridge Company. But the veto was overturned, and the next year the construction was authorized again, so it was moved to the Supreme Court. In 1831, it was not decided, but the reason that the Charles River Bridge Company claimed that they were taking it to the court not just for the loss of their profit, but because building the Warren Bridge would violate the Constitution's contract clause, and it would impair the obligation of their contract. So it took 6 years, but then it was argued again, and as you can see, it was in favor of the Warren Bridge, it was free. So the Charles River Bridge closed because travel along it ceased. No one took it anymore. So it closed, and then in 1841 they received a settlement, which was only $25,000, which was a little bit over what they were making in 1 year. So it wasn't that much for the loss of their business. So how it related to creative destruction. It wasn't a case that involved new technology. The bridges were pretty much identical. It wasn't like they were trying to build a new type of bridge. Basically, what it had to do with was population growth and economic expansion that facilitated a change that needed creative destruction. The goal was just to relieve the community of tolls. It wasn't to change anything about the bridge itself. And it's still relevant today because it presented legal rationale for endorsing and promoting creative destruction. It talked about how vested rights retain status in society but are subject to the pressures of public policy considerations, and those policies pretty much prefer technical innovation and economic change that benefit the community over the potential individual losses of a company like the Charles River Bridge Company. And so I think the biggest question that it asked was, how does the government distribute privilege in a way that meets the immediate needs of the community without repressing new developments? And the answer, which is what I'm going to leave you with, is, in short, privilege is accepted, even condoned perhaps too readily, to stimulate or maintain investment, and with certain restrictions it is available to any entrepreneurs or interests whose need can be justified to public policymakers. Yet when privilege lingers beyond the point of community need and becomes a source of profit mainly to the holder, it becomes a burden and may retard further innovations.